Welcome back to the Innovative Agency, everybody. Sharon Torek here with you again. And every once in a while, I think it's a great idea to take a step back and look at what the threads of sanity and constancy are in the agency world because we are surrounded by so much dynamism. Everything moves very quickly. Tactics change quickly. Certainly, technology changes quickly. There's lots of bright and shiny objects that your clients put pressure on you to integrate into the mix of the work that you're doing with them. Um, we're not going to talk about any of those with today's guest. We're going to talk about email. And email, on the face of it, might sound like not the sexiest thing in marketing to talk about, but if you and your clients are interested in talking about results achievement, but however you define it, then I think that today's conversation is really going to be powerful for you because time after time, year after year, the stats show that it does work, at least in my experience. And so Scott Cohen, President, CEO of Inbox Army, thank you for joining us today. A true email expert. I think you told me you've been working in email marketing for over 20 years, right? When we were having our conversation before we hit record.
Yeah, email 16, 17, something like that.
Yeah.
They all run together, let's be
Yeah.
honest. It's been long enough that it all runs together.
So that's quite a horizon of time for me to ask you this question. So this may be a little unfair, but I'm going to try it anyway. When you look back at email and how it has evolved since you've been specialized in it, if you will, where we are today, where do you see the biggest differences in either goals or metrics? What is the one biggest change you can point to
The
related
one
to email
biggest
marketing?
change.
Yeah, I mean, is it
Ooh.
tactical? Is it metric or measurement? Is it I don't know what, but I'd
I'll
love
give
to
you
know
a
what you think.
couple.
Yeah,
Yeah, I'll give you a couple. So I like to say that over the years, the why has not changed. We're
that's
still trying to
good.
communicate with customers. How do we get them through the customer experience? How do we make them feel valuable? How do we send relevant content? All the challenges are still there. It doesn't like that hasn't changed. The how certainly has, right? I mean, when I came on, some of the platforms that I used back in 2008, 2009 have either been bought or they're long gone, right? So
Mhm,
in terms of the how, the email service provider landscape, I mean, I think it's what Scott Brinker's Martech map,
mhm,
15 years ago was it could fit on a page
mhm.
on a PDF, and now the page is like
It's a poster, yeah, for
it could be
sure.
a wallpaper, right? I
Right,
mean,
right,
it's massive.
right.
So I think that the how has certainly changed, and the speed to market on certain things has changed. How do we do A/B testing, for example? How we do audience selection? It's always been how do we get the most, how do we get the closest to that one to one, right? That's always been the goal of email and really those own channels is that relevance at the one to one level, and we're getting closer. I would argue we're not there yet, and it's
Mhm,
certainly not scalable yet, but we're getting closer to that. On the metrics side, I think particularly after iOS 15 came out for Apple and mail privacy protection came out, and for those of you who use Apple Mail, essentially what's happened is if you use Apple Mail on your phone or on your iPad or on your iMac or whatever it might be, iMac, wow, that's yeah, they still exist. But your
mhm,
MacBook, right? It'll automatically open every email. It'll fire the pixel to load. So everyone's open rates went up within 6 months of iOS 15 launching because
mhm,
as people adopted it, everybody's new open rate benchmark went up. Now, open rate's always been directional. It's never been something I've taken seriously, no, or too seriously. It's always been like, okay, we're doing a somewhat good job, but it's always been conversions, right? So I would say the shift I'm seeing fewer and fewer people focusing on open rates as iOS 15 has happened. And it's a godsend that that's happening. But fewer and fewer people are focused on that. They're more focused on clicks, which are verifiable actions that can happen, and ultimately the conversions downstream. Now, I
mhm.
talk about how as well, like you've seen AMP for email. It's been around for 5+ years, and people are finally starting to use it.
Mhm.
You mostly see it overseas because it's a Gmail thing, it's an Android thing. Apple's pretty dominant here in the States. Overseas, not so much, not as much in terms of the market is there. So I see that as like, it's getting simultaneously easier and harder to actually pull these things off because people want to bring in AI and have AI be the easy button, which
Mhm. We're
it
gonna
is
talk
and it
about that
isn't.
for
And
sure.
we're going to talk about that, of
Yeah.
course. But then also just they're starting to focus on what matters too, which is ultimately those conversions, whatever they might be, purchases, appointments, whatever those conversions might be. That's ultimately, revenue is king, right? So that's ultimately what people need to focus on and less on those sort of vanity metrics like opens.
I'm interested in your point of view on this. Do you
Mhm.
feel that email has become underestimated or almost undervalued, not so much by agencies, but maybe by brands, because it is so powerful and the power of it is just um assumed, taken for granted, accepted. I don't know the right combination of words to use, but
Not as taken for granted as it used to be. I think
okay.
COVID, which I hate to bring up that word 4 years later, but it was a
It's
world
still
altering
impacting
event.
us,
Yeah, it's a
unfortunately.
world altering event, but I mean, COVID put email kind of back on the map. Now, in some ways, better than others. I mean, how many emails did you get in 2020 that you went,
Yeah,
I signed up for these guys? And
yeah.
now they're telling me they're closed and this is how they're handling COVID.
But they care
Um,
about me.
Right. But at the time I was brand side and it was a company I was in working for Purple, mattress company, had the wholesale thing. And they're like, we're going to give you time to build up a DTC side of business. And then
Mhm.
COVID happened. And it was like, oh, you need to do everything now. You need to do it right now. And so email became a big thing to drive not just first purchases, but repeat purchases. Right. So I think email's always been powerful. The ding against emails compared to other channels is cheap. And
Mhm.
when it's not a big budget item, CMOs don't give it the light of day.
Interesting.
Because if it's just something that's almost like for some companies, their email program could be a rounding error in their marketing budget because of how efficient email is, how inexpensive email is. I mean, when I worked at Purple, I had a consultant come in and go, if I gave you $5 million, how would you spend it? And I said, I wouldn't need $5 million. Give it to the website team. I need 1 million, right?
Mhm.
Because the program wasn't big enough at the time to need $5 million. But there are companies out there that even the big companies don't spend $5 million on email, even
Mhm.
today, because the CPMs have come down over the years. So that's why you see the numbers like, oh, it's $34 ROI or $42 ROI. And at Purple, I had a $438 ROI for every dollar I spent on email because I went, we're selling $4,000
Amazing.
mattresses. It's really easy. So
Yeah, that's amazing.
and I think because of that, like even when you want to increase your spend, it's hard to get that because they go, well, you're doing this with that much. Why do you need that much? And so it's funny when I go, but you're giving that money per day to display. And so I think for such an effective channel, it still can be underutilized because it's cheap. And
Right,
so that there's that sort of lack of um, respect that it gets because it's not a line item that people have to look at too often.
right. It's also very easy to misfire on, right? I mean, there is so much art and science that I think this is why people spend years and years and years trying to get their email right,
Oh
whether
yeah.
it's tone or whatever it is, but it is art and science. It's copywriting, it's understanding how to find the right audience, how to get them to and engage with you. And
Yep.
so it's easy to do wrong, I suppose, is the best way I could
Yes.
put it. So one of the things I like to do on the show is really to give agency owners takeaways that they could scale no matter what the size of their agency is.
Mhm.
And so, what do you think are a few things that any agency can do to up their game in terms of executing email strategies for their clients? Things that they may not be thinking about, or things that they just do by rote and don't haven't evolved. They're thinking on. What are some of those things that come to mind for you?
I'm a big Princess Bride fan. And so
Okay.
I always think about Vicini told me to go back to the beginning. So I have. I always go back to the beginning of what are those first hand raises for your clients, right?
Mhm.
So in each client, their life cycle is going to be a little different, but 95% of them, you can say somebody's going to have some form of a welcome, a first sort of sign up subscription to just getting email, more information. Then you're going to have some form of a, let's call it a cart abandon, but it could be an abandoned appointment setting. It could be an abandoned whatever it might be, right? E-commerce, obviously, it's a bit more straightforward. They have a cart, they filled it, they left.
Right.
Um, and then for a post-purchase process that goes beyond just an order confirmation and hopefully a shipping confirmation, which knowing email and knowing the clients that I deal with, they may not be coming from the same system. You may be having order confirmation coming from like a Shopify. You may have shipping confirmation come from a third party or your email service provider. Like you talked about technical sort of complications. Email can doesn't always live in one place, which can get really fun.
Mhm.
Um, but then the sort of the that space between purchase and a shipment of some sort, right? So maybe it's a delivery of a white paper, maybe it's okay, you have I scheduled an appointment for tomorrow or 3 days from now or a week from now. What do you do in that time? What do you do in that time between that shipment? And then if it is a physical product, what do you do in that time after the product ships but before it's I mean,
Got it.
Amazon kind of moved the goalpost, right? Of everybody expects everything to show up in 2 days or less. But it's not true for everybody. I mean, I just ordered something for my kid 4 months ago, and it literally, this is, I wish this was a joke. It literally came on the slow boat from China. Like it was just, it took 4 months to get here, I feel like. And they were very, it literally showed up this morning. They were very happy. But what do you do in that time frame to get people ready to use it or ready for the appointment or things like that? Those are pieces that you wouldn't be relying on your paid social for. You wouldn't be necessarily relying on like SEO content for. That's where email comes in. And to a certain extent, SMS, I would argue as well.
Mhm.
Although SMS, the cost per SMS is significantly higher than email. So
Mhm.
it's almost like email and then you start testing into SMS, right? Or you go, here's a shipping confirmation for text. People love, I don't know about you, but I love getting the email that says your order's coming tomorrow or hey,
Yeah.
by the way, your order's out for delivery. Like people love that kind of stuff, that sort of over communication. When I worked brand side, it was always how can we reduce phone calls to our customer service center? And the more you communicated through email, the less phone calls you got. So
Mhm.
there's that value of not just sort of driving those decisions, but also backing up the decisions that I think is super important for agencies to bring to their clients to go, hey, let's make sure the customer experience for every first hand raise with us is not perfect, but like built out to a point that maybe it's 3 emails for a welcome, a couple emails for cart abandon to start, and then maybe there's a gap between purchase and delivery that's 7 days. You have in, a couple, 3 emails in there to start, and then you test and you learn. And that's the great thing about email is testing and learning is so easy comparatively to other channels. And also, again, going back to the cost point, are you going to do a Facebook ad for somebody waiting for their shipment? I don't see it. So where does email fill in? And that's where I start at all times.
Mhm. Okay. It kind of aligns with the way I always advise when we're talking with our agency clients. It's just on legal strategy is start with the end in mind, right? And
Mhm.
if your goal is to enhance the consumer or the client experience so that they're more likely to be a multiple time purchaser, not just a one time purchaser, figure out how email fills in those straps and those gaps and those opportunities for communication. I love that.
Buyer's remorse is real. Whether we think about it or not, buyer's remorse is real. So in that time, I hate to say make them feel good about what they just did, but make them feel good about what they just did, right? Hey,
Right.
you made a great decision. By the way, here's when I worked for Purple, it was right before your mattress showed up. Here's how to get your room ready for
Mhm.
your new mattress. Here's what to expect. There might be a learning curve on your product, right? That
Mhm.
that you're promoting. And if it's a steep learning curve, more communication, right? Just make
Right.
sure that you're answering as many questions as you can. And email is a great path for that. The website, of course, is a great path for that. email and push go together really well if you have an app. So email can drive to an app can bring them. Usually, what I found is email marketers typically also own SMS and push because it's those sort of owned channels, right? The app is
Mhm.
something you own, the email address is something your clients or your customers own, obviously, but you kind of have that owned data piece. And so
Mhm.
that's yeah, that's where I'd be.
What I'm hearing too, though, is that talking through these opportunities with the agency's client is really giving the agency an opportunity to understand more about what the brand's customer experience looks like. And that can lead to opportunities to suggest additional strategies, additional work,
Yes,
which may or may not be email focused. Right?
correct.
Because you're learning more about the customer journey and it kind of inspires different ways of thinking about how you could impact that positively.
And those desired paths, right? So, and depending on what you're selling, you may have multiple products, multiple audiences, and every audience acts differently too.
Right.
So if you are B2B and B2C, for example, your B2B audience is going to act entirely differently from your B2C audience.
Mhm.
Sometimes they act the exact same way, but they're still human after all. But you're selling different things. Your life cycle after purchase might be different. You may only have one product on the B2B side, but you have lots of products on the B2C side. You're
Yeah.
going to treat them differently. And so I always say go back to the beginning because make sure those important first touches are done. And then once those are done and built, and you're going to want to have a testing, sort of an ongoing iteration testing analysis piece as well to do improvements. But those programs make a ton of money, make
Mhm.
a ton of money. And if they're automated, they make a ton of money while you're working on the shinier objects.
Mhm. So that's a good pivot point, automation, because it reminds me of what I wanted to ask you next, which is that I'm sure you see a lot of email done badly. And I don't just mean typos or, some technical glitches, but I'm sure you see a lot of examples of where the strategy is just not on point or there's opportunities missed, whatever it might be. But what are some takeaways that agency owners and leaders listening can get about their own execution of email strategies and programs for their brand clients? Where do you see the most likely and lowest hanging fruit for improvement?
The unfortunate thing about email is that bad email still makes money. So,
Well,
I mean,
okay.
I mean, why does spam exist? Because spam works enough that
I
yeah,
know. Isn't
people
that a
still do.
sad truth in life?
I mean, it's true. And I hate to say it, but it's true. I mean, people go, well, why does spam still exist? Because it freaking works, apparently. Nobody would keep doing it if it didn't work.
Mhm.
So it's a sad state of affairs. But, I always, again, going back to the beginning, at a minimum, know what your customers have done, right? So if you're just doing some sales emails that are broad site wide emails, that's fine. You can, you know, maybe you can get a little bit more personalized in some product recommendations, things like that. If you're going to feature products, maybe you can go, there's a generic version, then, hey, we know they bought this, do these for, we know they bought this, do these for, et cetera, et cetera.
Mhm.
From a design side, sort of very nuts and bolts, do not do image only emails because in one, if you're borderline on deliverability and you don't have a good mix of HTML and image, you can get dinged from a deliverability perspective. And that's a
Mhm.
whole different world that if you really wanted to dive deep, I know 3 or 4 nerds that would be, I love them to death, but it's deliverability people are kind of like the accountants. Like you love them and thank God they're there because you
Maybe
don't
we'll
want to
have a
get that
nerd
deep.
panel at some point on this.
Yeah, you should totally have a nerd panel. I love them to death. But but also from an accessibility standpoint, I mean, you do legal, right? I mean, there's not really you have to sue. There's not really like statute. I mean, some states are bringing them in now, but the ADA is not. And I just learned this the other couple weeks ago on our own podcast. Is there's not really an enforcement arm. It's up to the person making the claim, right? To
Yeah.
get get it through. So,
There are
but if you
guidelines, and then there is a cottage industry of of taking pseudo legal action on said guidelines, but no, there are no
Yes,
direct absolute requirements on accessibility yet. I wish there were
correct.
because it would be a clearer dividing line between what to do and
Yeah.
not to.
And that's what email marketers need is like, hey, tell me what I'm allowed to do.
Yeah. What can I get away
And
with?
what yeah.
And what can't I get
Um
away with? Yeah.
exactly, right? And even then you get people who are surprised. I can't do that. Well, no, not really. I
Mhm.
mean, legally that's allowed here in the States, but nowhere else. Don't dare do this in Canada or the EU.
Yeah.
But going back to it, accessibility is a big thing of, there's contrast for colors. There's, if it's all images, for example, a lot of screen readers could read alt text, but they may not be able to read all the alt text. You kind of lose the point of it. There are providers that automatically block images by default. And then your email goes from this beautiful thing to it looks like this, right? Where it's just this little thing. So in terms of general usability, there needs to be that balance, right? And I see that all the time of, oh, it's just this beautiful image because email can't support all the fonts that people want to support.
Mhm.
Or, hey, I've got this beautiful custom font. And I go, great, what's your backup?
Mhm.
Well, what do you mean? Well, Gmail will tear it out, or Outlook will tear it out, or AOL will tear it out. Yes, people are still on AOL. And it might go to Arial, it might go to Helvetica, depending on what thing you're on. It might go to Times New Roman. People still default to that for some reason, but there's like this cascading thing and that you need to be aware of, right? So those are the things I typically see. I also, of course, see I don't know how I'm getting emails for George for Pinterest. And I go, well, there's clearly a data error there, or somebody's
Mhm.
you Gmail. My pet peeve with Gmail is that Scott.Cohen and Scott Cohen are treated the same as the same email address in Gmail, which
Oh,
drives me insane.
interesting.
Um, and yeah. So there's a lot of those little things I can nitpick. Strategically, I see people just defaulting to the larger sales. And like I said, they work, and there's a certain extent that scale becomes a problem. Or just, hey, just get something out the door. There's always that balance between we could be super highly personalized and all this, and is it worth the rub? Is the juice worth the squeeze?
Mhm.
And in some cases, it may not be, right? But I think that those sort of execution pieces, design that factors in accessibility, that allows for a balance of image and HTML coded text, and like your calls to action should never be images. It
Mhm.
should be some sort of button or text link or something that is coded so that it won't be stripped out if images are suppressed.
Mhm.
And of course, if it can't be read on a screen reader, then how does the person know how to use it? So, what is it? Something like 28% of the country have some sort of disability recognized under ADA, and it's like 13% of that has some sort of I can't remember the stats off the top of my head, but
Mhm.
it's a bigger chunk than people realize. And I'm wearing glasses, so go figure. But
Yeah.
I don't think I'd qualify. My prescription's pretty mild, but
Mhm.
just I mean, I'm getting to the age where if the text is too small, I'm like, guys, could you code it a little bit larger so I can read this? And by the way, don't do centered text if you have a lot of text because I can't read that either.
Okay, these are all great tips to take
Yeah.
away. I mean, agency owners listening to this, tell your nerds about all this stuff. This is important.
And
Um,
listen to your nerds,
yeah,
please, because they
yeah,
know their stuff. They're living it every day.
right. And
And
they're trying to make the work better and
they're
more
trying to make the
effective.
work better. And they're not, most of them, there might be one that's just being negative for the sake of being negative. But most of the time, they're telling you this because they know it'll burn you. So listen to them.
I love it. That's great advice. Um, all right. So the big elephant in the email room is AI's impact on just about every aspect. I mean, we could probably spend another episode talking about data privacy for sure.
Hmm.
But
Hmm.
I think I am receiving, I don't think any emails written by AI that I don't recognize as AI written, which means to me that, as you said earlier, we're not there yet in terms of quality, in terms of authenticity, in terms of um, actual human insight as reflected in the communication. We'll get there, but we're not there. And so that's just a consumer's observation, you know, being on the receiving end of these
Yeah.
messages. What are you seeing out there? What are the primary, I mean, I'm sure you're seeing a ton of challenges with this, but what are the primary issues you're seeing right now with email as a practice, as a tactic, and an impact that AI is having on it?
I think AI is this great umbrella term
Mhm,
that is legitimately pulling in things that are net new, but pulling in a lot of things that are not new. I mean, what we could consider AI, we probably called big data 10 years ago.
mhm,
Or dynamic content is something that's been around for quite a while. Now, the speed to market is getting faster as AI takes it on and learns, but dynamic content's been around. Audience segmentation at a, sort of that best logical audience. I mean, that's been around for 5, 10 years, right? In some
mhm,
form. Obviously, it's getting better. And this, like I said, that speed to market and the accuracy gets better. But what is it learning from? And I think the big thing is the reason that you're seeing stuff come out you can tell is AI generated is because it's learning from everybody. It's not learning from that person that you're
mhm,
receiving the email from. So like if I went out and I Reed Hoffman of LinkedIn just did this, I think a couple months ago, was he built literally had an AI engine and he threw in everything he's ever written, spoken, done, and threw everything in it and then interviewed himself in quotation marks. And it
mm,
was scary how good it was, but that's because it was trained on him alone.
mhm.
Whereas, so I think the
Oh,
companies that will do AI well are the ones that build their own engine, their own machine learning engine to learn them. They're going to have to, because if you pull in factors from outside, that's when the line between what your brand is and what isn't will get fuzzy, right? Because they're pulling, I mean, all these AI models and engines are doing is learning from the inputs they're given.
right.
And if you don't control the inputs, you're not going to control the outputs. So and my worry on the email side, but really on the like the chat GPT side is that we're going to get and I'm already seeing it where we're getting to a point where it's good enough, right? Like chat GPT right now should be a starter. It should not be an ender. Right. You could
Mhm,
throw in something and say, hey, edit this for me. That's fine. I mean, Grammarly is AI driven. Spell check, you could argue, is an AI engine. It's just been around for 30 years.
right,
Right.
right,
So
yeah,
it's a very basic AI, but I mean, I was talking to a guy the other day and he said AI has been around for 50 years.
yeah,
It's just we've been calling it different things until now.
mhm,
And do we get beyond the point where we worry about Sky? Like we're getting to the point where we're not worried about Skynet anymore or the Matrix, which frightens me from a entertainment perspective. But it's I worry that the good enough piece, and that's where we get into bad email as well, right? It's like, hey, bad email still performs to a certain extent. Whatever, just get it out the door. Whatever, just let ChatGPT do it, and you're ceding control of everything to an engine that is not learning just from you. And so
mhm.
I think what's happening is this homogenization. Wow, that's my SAT word of the day.
Yeah, no, it's a
Homogenization of
perfect word
content.
for it.
Yeah, it's just everything's becoming the same.
Yeah,
And
very mediocre in addition to homogeneous.
homogenize, commoditize. I mean,
Yeah,
that's the danger I think we get into is that we're all going to sound the same, and how you make sales is that you're different, right? How you get new customers, how you retain customers is about difference. And if you're not training those models on why you're different, you're not going to be different, at least publicly.
right. Oh, that's a great quote. You're not training them, you're not gonna be different. I like it. So true. So, what I tell agencies, just from a risk management perspective around integrating AI into their work, is that the human guardrails are still imperative.
For
Um,
sure.
would you say the same just in terms of executing from a marketing perspective or sales perspective? I think you did just kind of say the same thing, just in
No, yeah.
reverse.
There needs to be human oversight simply because, I mean, I've run tests in my life, and I would say 90% of the A/B tests I've run in my career have been performance has been flat between the two versions, right? And the reason is, or it's not quite flat, but it's not statistically significant one way or the other, right?
Mhm.
And so, can the AI know why you're learning something? They'll know what. They can look at the numbers. If they go, hey, we're going to make a decision based off of this data improvement, but they're not going to know necessarily why. The instant they know why, that's going to be pretty scary. Let's be fair.
Yeah.
But I think about like the tests I've run. There's two main types of tests I like to think about. There's the test that I call there's the test to win, and then there's the test to replace. So testing to replace has a different threshold. So for example, I at a previous company we went through a rebrand. And the idea was we wanted to get the new brand look and feel to be at the same level of performance as the old brand look and feel. Because once it got there, we could replace it, right?
Mhm.
Once we got it there, we could replace it. We didn't have to win. We just had to get it good enough that it could replace, and we wouldn't have to worry about. You talked about risk management and risk mitigation, right? Like we're not going to
Correct.
do 100% replacement until it's at the level we feel comfortable to perform. So we
Right.
did that. When you're trying to replay, when you're trying to do winners, it's a whole. You have to get statistically significant improvement, right? That's what you're looking for to replace the old direct marketing test and control model of okay, the control is this, we have to beat the crap out of it for that to become the new control, and
Mhm.
then we test against that. So those are two different layers. I guess you could go, hey, this becomes a winner in the AI once you set that data, but you do have to ask yourself why. Okay, why did this do this? What were we doing here that works better? And right now, and I might be wrong, but I haven't seen data to suggest otherwise or stories to suggest otherwise that why component AI is not bringing themselves. So you need that human to go, yeah, that's working, but it's actually not what we want to be saying, right? Like,
Mhm.
because you talk about that content control, that copy control, you're in legal. God forbid that the marketing team comes out with something that works amazing. And then you go, don't say that. You're opening us up to so many lawsuits.
Mhm.
Like the things that could work may not work. And if
Right.
they don't have those guardrails in place or they don't have that human knowledge to go, you know what? You can't really say it that way. I know it works great, but if you say it that way, that guy's going to sue, that guy's going to sue, that guy's going to sue.
Yeah.
And I
Yeah.
mean, I've worked in businesses where we threw things into legal and I'm like, why can't we say this? Well, because it opens you up to this. And I go,
Yeah.
but the
Every
CEO
day.
says if the CEO says they're open to that risk, then we'll let it go. I'm like, oh, okay.
And you're going to be the one to run that one up the flagpole, not
Exactly.
because
Yep.
I want to keep my job. Yeah, I understand 100%. Um, what do you think the biggest, what are you excited for with respect to email marketing, like over the next 12 to 18 months? What do you see
Oh,
coming that you think is going to be um, either, I don't know, maybe it'll be revolutionary, maybe it will just be um, raise the, you know, raise the playing field for everybody. What do you see coming?
I think, email marketers are really good at being stewards of the data. And so what I've seen and what I push for when I was brand side is more integration between email and the other channels.
Mm.
And I think that's going to continue to happen because the data can make email smarter. It can make paid social smarter. It can make SEO smarter. It can make DTV, OTV, OTT smarter. Like all these things, they actually do all work together.
Hmm.
And, my career has been, God, this is another silo. Yeah, yeah, yeah. We're the weird, awkward stepchildren in the back of the room type thing. But we just make money. So who cares? It's, you don't care how the sausage is made sometimes. But I think what I'm excited about is the continued understanding of what data we should be collecting. You mentioned we could talk about privacy forever, and there's how AI can help you collect data.
Hmm.
Are they making assumptions or just helping you collect data that you actually use? There's the whole collection versus usage thing that I'm not going to get into.
Yeah.
But I think it's going to be interesting to watch how data becomes increasingly more important to everybody. I mean, that's the ultimate currency. We are Facebook's customers, right? I mean, that's
We're their
it just,
inventory too.
exactly right. We're the inventory for all of these channels that we then pay more money to promote on, which is
Yep.
hysterical. Um, but I see just this sort of, I'm hoping that we see this sort of conglomeration of marketing teams working together. Because the biggest success I've seen in my brand side days were when we worked with the paid social team and then we worked with the organic social team, and like all of us came together to promote a single thing, and they all worked together and there was a flow. And
Mhm.
those were the pieces that worked really, really well. And I know from an email agency perspective, it's hard to get that in front of clients because they're like, yeah, 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 you just focus on that one thing. And then
Mhm.
I'm the weird guy raising my hand going, what about your other channels? Well, why are you worried about those? Well, it can make mine better. It could.
Yeah, well,
And
collaboration is rare.
oh
I
yeah,
mean, and so, if email can be a channel for making that occur, then I think that would be very positive development.
data management, data ownership sits there. You want to make your channels smarter, go talk to your email teams. Agencies, go tell your email teams to go talk to their other teams and go, hey, we can make you better. You want to know what kind of customers we're bringing in. Because again, like paid social can drive traffic. If they sign up for email and the email isn't there, the email team's going to look pretty bad. If
Mhm.
they, but the paid social team probably wants those conversions too. Because I went, well, how many signups are you driving? Don't just worry about whether they purchase in that same time frame. We can make your spend a whole lot more efficient if you just drive to signups, drive to
Yeah,
that.
and
We
have the
can we
right
can
data
pick
to
them
do
up,
it.
right?
Yeah,
Yeah.
I love it. That's a total mic drop piece of advice, I think, for
Go
the
talk to
agency
everybody.
and that's right. Talk to your email people.
Like
It's
it's like a sitcom, right? Or like 90% of the issues on sitcoms would be diffused if they just actually talk to each other. Like
totally,
it's the
totally,
same
yeah,
thing with marketing teams.
exactly. That's very, very true and profound, actually. Well, this has been a great learning. I mean, I think we definitely take a strategy, I should say a tactic, sometimes a strategy, email for granted. And it's good to sort of peel away the layers of the onion
Mhm.
and determine how much of it really informs the other things that we do in an agency. And also, how we should be sort of reevaluating our take it for granted approach to how email's
Absolutely.
working. Just because it's working doesn't mean it can't be working better, right?
Yep.
So, yeah. So to that end, I know that one of the things that you do at Inbox Army is collaborate with other agencies. And so, where's the best place or places for agency owners and leaders to find out more about what Inbox Army does and how to connect with you?
Absolutely. You can find me, Scott Cohen, on LinkedIn. It's linkedin.com/and/slash Scott Cohen 13. So you can just find me on LinkedIn, ping me anytime. Inboxarmy.com, super easy to remember. We're a full service email agency. We do white label as well. So if you have interest in learning about what we do, just check us out there and say you heard me on the podcast. And
Yes,
we're
please.
happy to chat.
Yes, please. All right, Scott, this has been an awesome conversation. Thank you so much for sharing your wisdom and your experience with us. And I hope everybody learned a lot. I know I certainly did. So I appreciate you for being on the
Thank
show today. Thank you for joining me.
thank you for having me.
My pleasure. All right, everybody. Thank you for joining me as well. It was great to have you all. And until the next time we're together, everybody stay well. Bye.